The probability of us being alone in our universe is 0.
If you ever wondered if the show, Project Bluebook, premiering on the 8th of January 2019, is a work of fiction, let us quickly assure you that it is not. In fact, what this show is based on is a true story of a government project that was carefully swept under the rug. The project, as you might well know, is the Project Bluebook.
The Air Force has recently made public Project Bluebook, an archive of UFO reports and investigations dating back to the 1940s. The report includes more than 12,000 sightings made by military members and civilians. While most of the cases were explained as either satellites, weather balloons, high-flying jets, or even meteors, still hundreds of cases remain unidentified.
What you may think you know about the project might not be completely true. However, we shall now try to delve into what really happened with this investigation, what its mission is, and why it had to be aborted and kept classified for a long time. To go back to the beginning, we have to head as far back as 1947.
I am here to discuss the so-called flying saucers. The Air Force interest in this problem has been due to our feeling of an obligation to identify and analyze to the best of our ability anything in the air that may have the possibility of threat or menace to the United States.
This was just as the Cold War was starting. There was suspicion in the air, and there were many reasons for this.
The first thing we do is to try to disprove it. Because what is the point of establishing, of perpetuating a myth or something that isn't so? And it turns out that some 90% of the raw reports, see, we have a nationwide police network, an 800 number that the police use, and we get reports every night from police departments or different parts of the country. Most of them are planets, twinkling stars,
explainable or identifiable things.
The IFOs, we call them, identifiable flying objects. But that remaining 10%, those are the ones we go after. Now, a UFO, the U in UFO, of course, simply means unidentified. It does not necessarily mean visitors from outer space.
So, when a businessman and pilot known as Kenneth Arnold made a report on June 24, 1947, it quickly raised the fever. Kenneth's report was clear and direct. He had observed 9 flat disc-like aircraft near Mount Rainier, Washington. They were flying at incredibly high speed. His description of them was so vivid, and the press, who quickly dubbed those aircrafts as flying saucers, was the beginning of thousands of other similar reports. In fact, between that first incident in 1947 and when Project Bluebook was terminated in 1969, a total of 12,618 sightings of strange things moving in the sky had been reported across the United States. When the Project Bluebook was carefully shut down, the U.S. Air Force gave a number of grounds that have since been its official stand. No UFO reported, investigated, and evaluated by the Air Force has ever been given any indication of threat to our national security. There has been no evidence submitted to or discovered by the Air Force that sightings characterized as unidentified represent technological developments or principles beyond the range of present-day scientific knowledge, and there has been no evidence indicating that sightings characterized as unidentified are extraterrestrial vehicles.
However, there have been a certain percentage of this volume of reports that have been made by credible observers of relatively incredible things. It is this group of observations that we now are attempting to resolve. We can say that the recent sightings are in no way connected with any secret development by any department of the United States.
This is part of the official statement, but a lot more was involved in the case of Project Bluebook. So why would the U.S. Air Force do that? Was Project Bluebook a failure, or was it just a fluke? There are a number of things to note.
There was even a press conference where the Air Force basically acknowledged to the American public that UFOs could very well be real.
Major Keyhole, what is your opinion of these new sightings of unidentified objects?
I believe that some of them will prove to be of interplanetary origin.
Keep in mind that the U.S. Air Force is the agency in charge of the surety of the airspace all over the nation. It was at the beginning of the Cold War when reports started rolling in. The initial reaction was a bit frantic at first.
Truman set up what was known as the Robertson Panel. It was a CIA group that was tasked to look into how to handle the UFO situation.
There were suspicions about which country may be responsible. Many suspected that these strange aircrafts could be from the Soviet Union. Others wondered if it was another country. With the suspicion, the Air Force quickly launched what was then known as Project Sign. This would be followed by other investigations, Project Bluebook being one of them.
Reports from military pilots, and that was particularly embarrassing to the Air Force because after they had trained those men, and they couldn't very well, they could say that a civilian pilot might have been untrustworthy, but they could hardly say that to of their own military pilots, and we got case after case after case from military pilots which never hit the press.
War was ramping up, and the mood of the nation was one of great concern and worry, and now you have this whole thing. You don't know who these other beings are. You don't know what their intentions are. You really don't know anything about them, except that they're not us. And so it's this tremendous unknown.
Project Sign. Project Sign was the initial response, but it only lasted for just over a year. At first, it appeared as if the U.S. Air Force were trying to actually discover what the unidentified flying objects were.
What do you think the government knows about UFOs that they're not telling us?
Now, in my association with Project Bluebook, I know very well that it was not a scientific project. Also, I also know that they never would notify the media when an interesting case came up. They did everything they could to keep it down. So they definitely withheld information. I will not go so far as to say that it was a Machiavellian, sinister cover-up
or conspiracy.
Conspiracy. Yeah. I don't like those terms, but withholding of documents, yes, and that's exactly what Peter Gersten has been so good at.
Project Sign was actually taken somewhat seriously. According to the report of a captain of the U.S. Air Force, Captain Edward J. Ruppelt, the intelligence specialists at the Air Technical Intelligence Center, ATIC, were so confident of getting answers to the UFO problem within a year at most. By the way, you might want to keep the name of Captain Edward J. Ruppelt in mind, because he would later become a Project Bluebook director and the author of a book titled The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects.
Captain Edward Ruppelt, the first chief of the Air Force's UFO investigation group, Project Bluebook, actually spoke and wrote about this. He stated,
UFOs were seen more frequently around areas vital to the defense of the United States.
Back to Project Sign. The UFO problem that the intelligence specialists at ATIC was looking to solve had nothing to do with if these UFOs existed or not. It was more about where it is from. Could it be the Russians at work? Or should we really gaze into space for answers? Could these UFOs have come from some other planet? Their findings would cause an internal split inside the group. There were those who believed that the UFOs were indeed from outside the planet Earth.
Major Keyhole, what is your opinion of these new sightings of unidentified objects?
I believe that some of them will prove to be of interplanetary origin.
Well, there were others who maintained that it couldn't be true. By the time Project Sign ended, the official results were inconclusive. In their report, the flying saucers were neither confirmed nor denied. But that really wasn't the end of it. A document was authored by the project in 1948, and the document was called The Estimate of the Situation. This document was sent to the command chain of the U.S. Air Force. Ruppelt revealed that the majority of the specialists who worked on Project Sign were particularly impressed by one of the many reports of sightings. This particular report was the Childs-Whitted UFO encounter of the 24th of July 1948. This incident involved two pilots whose Douglas DC-3 airliner was almost hit by a torpedo-shaped UFO. The conclusion was that the level of technology that must have gone into such an aircraft could not have been realistic for either the US or the USSR. The only logical explanation was that it was from another planet. This belief was stated clearly in the document.
When you say document, that could be a lease or title to a house. A document is something that's thought of being a heavy piece of paper. A document can also be a very simple piece of paper that contains really non-usable information. So you're using the word 900 documents.
900 pages of documents.
Right.
I don't know exactly.
Well, what do these pages document?
Sightings, but what are referred to in the documents by responsible, reliable persons. You see, all along, before these documents were released, we've been reading civilian reports about individuals who've been seeing flying saucers or UFOs or flying discs, and their credibility. Now in the documents, these pages that were released by the FBI, the CIA, we see there was no question in the government's mind that these persons were reliable. They're referred to in the documents as early as 1949 as reliable, responsible military officials, generals, Air Force personnel, seeing these unconventional aerial objects.
But guess what? The document was rejected by the Air Force for lack of physical evidence. What's more, all copies were ordered to be destroyed. The U.S. Air Force would later deny the existence of this document, even resisting any attempt to use the Freedom of Information Act in getting a hold of it. However, Ruppelt and several other sources confirmed the existence of this document. One of these sources was Dr. Alan Hynek. Dr. Hynek was a scientific consultant and UFO skeptic brought in to work on both Project Sign and Project Bluebook.
For 22 years, Dr. Hynek served as a scientific consultant for the U.S. Air Force's investigation into UFOs, called Project Bluebook.
His role and shocking transformation will be discussed shortly. But Project Sign wasn't shut down to start Project Bluebook. There was another project in between. This project is called Project Grudge.
Dr. J. Allen Hynek investigated UFOs for the United States Air Force for over 22 years. The most well-known of these investigations was Project Bluebook.
And there's nothing in the records which would indicate that we have been visited by any advanced civilization.
There's nothing to hide.
There's nothing to hide at all.
Project Grudge is a fine example of how to appear productive when, in reality, you are busy doing nothing. Project Grudge was a total fluke, set up with one single aim: debunk all reports and find natural explanations for those you can't. Needless to say, many of those explanations were completely illogical.
Our critics continually charged that the United States Air Force is withholding information from the general public on this subject. This is absolutely untrue.
And there's nothing in the records which would indicate that we have been visited by any advanced civilization.
There's nothing to hide.
There's nothing to hide at all.
Investigations were rarely conducted since the conclusion is already known. Any little investigation done was tailored to lead right back to the preconceived answer. This continued until the UFO sighting reported around Fort Monmouth in New Jersey in September of 1951. A number of pilots and radar operators observed these fast-moving and highly maneuverable aircrafts that are shaped like discs. It took a direct order by the head of Air Force Intelligence at the Pentagon, Major General Charles P. Capell, to swing the investigators into action. When a meeting was called, it became clear that the investigators at Project Grudge had been taking all reports as a huge joke. This realization made General Charles P. Capell push for the dissolution of Project Grudge and its replacement by Project Bluebook. The project intended to take the sightings really seriously. With huge determination, Captain Edward J. Ruppelt, remember him from Project Sign, was put in charge of Project Bluebook, and work commenced immediately. It was Ruppelt that created the name Unidentified Flying Object (UFO) to replace the press-publicized flying saucer. Data were gathered and placed under high scrutiny. When the results of the study were released, it shocked the skeptics. A clean 22% of the 3,200 reports studied were labeled as unknown. That means they couldn't be explained away. That is huge, and the report shook the beliefs of many. One of such people is the astronomer, Dr. Alan Hynek, who was hired as a scientific consultant during Project Sign and also for Project Bluebook. He was a straight UFO skeptic who worked at the time in the Department of Physics and Astronomy at Ohio State. He had treated the whole thing as an utterly ridiculous fad that would go away soon enough. He would try debunking any of the sightings, claiming that there was surely a natural explanation. After observing and conducting research for years with no easy explanation for some of what he personally saw and heard, Dr. Alan Hynek would later conclude that, indeed, these were not fads. The sightings of UFO were real, and they point to something outside this planet. This led him to become a passionate believer in what we now know as UFOs. He founded the Center for UFO Studies, wrote several books, and was a technical advisor for Close Encounters of the Third Kind, an iconic film about UFOs released in 1977. So, you would expect the Project Bluebook to gain international interest, right? Well, think again. What followed was as strange as the UFO sightings themselves. In 1953, Captain Edward J. Ruppelt, the director that had worked hard since the previous year to get out the report, suddenly left the project. What was left of Project Bluebook was a shadow of itself, a device used for public relations. Earlier in 1952, a panel of scientists had been convened by the CIA. After meeting for 12 hours over the period of 4 days, the reports worked on by Captain Edward J. Ruppelt, Dr. Alan Hynek, and many others were brushed under the carpet. The idea was that, if given enough time, all those sightings could be explained away. The motion of the meeting was switched to calming down the public. A public relations campaign was proposed to debunk and remove the aura of mystery from the UFOs, all in an attempt to take away the public's attention. Project Bluebook was stripped of most of its power and resources and was transformed into a debunking device. Of course, this frustrated Captain Edward J. Ruppelt, thus making him leave. When Major Robert J. Friend tried to resuscitate the project years later, he got little cooperation and even a more limited budget. Everything went downhill from there. In 1969, Project Bluebook was terminated and its file declassified. But the damage has been done. Many reports have been debunked by the project after Ruppelt left. Other documents related to UFO, which were not held by the Project Bluebook, still remain classified, despite pressures and lawsuits from private UFO groups. And the public? Well, the public has moved on. The latter mission of Project Bluebook seemed to work more than the former. While the U.S. Air Force would secretly continue their investigation, the public stance still remains. Once again, the public is kept in the dark.